Welcome to Core Cultivation. Here we explore different physical, lifestyle, and mindset moves to support your mental well being. I'm Marcia, wellness coach and fitness instructor, here to offer practical info to support your wellness journey. Please note, the information and opinion shared here is not to be used as therapy or replacement for the professional guidance given by your physician or mental health care providers. You acknowledge you are responsible for your own physical, mental, and emotional well being and hereby release Psychor Fitness from any and all liability. If you are having suicidal thoughts, please dial 988 or visit the nearest emergency room. Alrighty, y'all, let's talk. Hey there, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you. As always, I'm Marcia, wellness coach and fitness instructor. Today, looking at addressing some of the unprocessed emotional stress and trauma related to the current political era as well as the pandemic. I kind of touched on some of this before in one of my episodes on how your body has not gotten over the pandemic or the ways your bodies are still impacted by the pandemic, the idea of emotional stress that we're still holding on to, and with the election and just some observations, multiple things. I wanted to revisit that. So, what I'm sharing today is political somewhat, but also just related to the pandemic. It's not necessarily intended to come across as if I am on one side or the other, but I do want to draw attention to the emotional trauma and the emotional stress that many people are experiencing. So I guess that said, let me just say this episode is probably going to be a little bit longer than some of my more recent ones, and I'm going to try to organize everything in such a way that makes it easy to track uh, what I'm trying to convey and articulate. This is coming from my observation and perspective as a mental health professional and interest in mental well-being. If you listen to some of my other episodes, there is a difference between mental health and mental well-being. My observation as a mental health professional and counselor is that stress levels have just been peaking and spiking since the pandemic. That's not necessarily new news, but I'm wanting to make sure that I articulate that's part of why you're getting this episode. So, yes, political, but also pandemic related. That said, while it's coming from my mental health perspective, please know my disclaimers. This is not intended to serve as therapy or counseling. I am not operating in a counseling role here. What I share here is not intended to take the place of any therapy or professional guidance or advice given to you by your doctors or medical professionals or mental health professionals. This is more from a mental well being perspective, as far as how you can be proactive and aware and taking advantage and utilizing some of the everyday tools that you have at your disposal to just support your overall well being. So, this again, not therapy, not counseling, more just general information, educational, psychoeducational, and coaching. I also want to frame what I'm going to share similar to a bad or toxic relationship. So that said, if you have been or are impacted by a toxic, unhealthy, abusive, or some type of relationship, then be mindful of how you're listening to this episode. I'm not necessarily getting into any particular weeds or anything, but just be aware. Feel free to disconnect, tap out when you need to for your own emotional care and safety. But I'll be trying to frame some of my observations in that context to make it relatable if possible. I'm also going to try and address this from a timeline of pre pandemic, during the pandemic, and post pandemic. Pre pandemic being the 3 years of the presidency, first term presidency prior to March 2020. And then the pandemic being March 2020, maybe up to 2023. into the next administration, and then maybe 2023 up to the present moment. So I'll be hovering around those kind of timelines. I also want to acknowledge that there is fatigue and weariness on all sides, both sides, whether you consider yourself Republican, Democrat, Independent. There are a lot of people who find the behavior and antics of the president just fatiguing and wearying. And I want to just make sure that I'm putting that out there, that everybody, many people have felt that way, regardless of their political stance. You can maybe agree with policies, but not necessarily the person and some of the extra that you get with the policy. So, all of that said, I think that's all the disclaimers and the setup. Again, I appreciate your being here and your patience as I try to bring all this out and express it in a way that makes sense. Coming from this mental health and mental well being perspective, I want to acknowledge the fact that pre pandemic, during the pandemic, and post pandemic, we have all been experienced and exposed to some trauma. And for some of you, you may feel like that is an exaggerated word to use, or you feel like maybe it's being overutilized or whatever. But just the fact that we came through and are on the other side of a pandemic, not I had a couple of bad years on the job, not I'm dealing with a broken relationship, a pandemic. There was a public health and public safety emergency that shut down the world for an extended period, a pandemic. So just acknowledging that that's not an everyday occurrence. That's not an everyday stressor. That's not traffic. That's not they ran out of the food that I wanted to buy at the store. That's a life or death type of situation and stressor that we were dealing with for days, weeks, months, and years, just not wanting to minimize that. So let's go on and get a definition of trauma. And I'm going to reference the definition provided by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. And so they describe individual trauma as an event or circumstance resulting in physical harm, emotional harm, and or life-threatening harm. The event or circumstance has lasting adverse effects on the individual's mental health, their physical health, their emotional health, their social well-being and or spiritual well-being. All of this applies to the pandemic. Now, there are a number of things that cause trauma for us pre, during, and post pandemic. And that's what I want to give attention to. So here's our definition of trauma. We've got an understanding that it is physical harm, emotional harm. So this is the harm that we don't see, but sometimes we minimize because we can't see it and we can't put our hands on it. We don't necessarily give it the weight or attention that it might deserve. And of course, the life threatening harms of pandemic is just that, life threatening. The other thing is that it causes adverse effects on the individual's mental health, their physical health. And as I mentioned, I'm seeing and have seen stress levels spiking since the pandemic, and also emotional health, social well being. We know relationships and our social lives were significantly impacted by the pandemic, as well as our spiritual well being possibly being impacted. So now that we have an understanding of trauma, let's go on and take a look at this with that timeline. So, pre pandemic, 3 years under the president's first term, we look at the collective trauma that we experienced. This is 3 years of rhetoric, pick your ism, whether we're looking at racism, misogynistic behavior, sexist, like all of those things were there. In addition to the behavior existing, there was also verbal attacks, verbal abuse, gaslighting, manipulation, and hearing from someone who lacks empathy, who does not have the capacity to empathize. So you're getting all of these things being said and done, and it's magnified by the access to media. and you're getting a constant barrage of the tweets here and the retweets and the social media recycling, but also the regular television network media who covers all of those things and has to recycle and just revisit things over and over again. So we've got the behavior, the situation, whatever, the rhetoric itself, and then it almost being recycled and re-injuring people the more that you have to hear it. That's what we're all experiencing collectively. And some aspects of this experience by those on either side of the aisle. From an individual perspective, pre pandemic, 3 years prior to March 2020, you also had whatever individual stressors were going on in your life. So, whatever was the issue, maybe you were dealing with an unhealthy relationship, maybe there was job stress, like whatever was going on in your life, you had the individual stressors on your plate that maybe nobody else knows about, things you were already dealing with that you were carrying into in pre pandemic. Looking at it from the perspective of a toxic relationship, there are some people who are being targeted, who are on the receiving end of those antics, the rhetoric, the bad behavior, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the emotional abuse, all of that. For those people who are on the receiving end of that, they have friends, they have family. They may have a good neighbor who they have had a lifelong friendship for years. This neighbor is fully aware and has observed and observes how this individual is being targeted, manipulated, gaslit, like all of these things. The person who's on the receiving end of that emotional attack and verbal attack sees how and observes how their friend, their neighbor from all these years responds to witnessing the individual complete these attacks. And so for that victim, that's going to create some feelings. The neighbor has some different ways that they could potentially respond to the attack and the abuse and the manipulation that they're seeing. They could choose to say nothing. They could choose to get engaged and fight back. They might also choose to empower the person who is doing the manipulation and spewing the rhetoric. Whatever they choose to do, the person who's on the receiving end of all that, that's going to impact their relationship, right? I'm saying all this to say, think about those in your circle of friends, family, or whatever, who you may have broken relationships with prior to the pandemic. People who you felt were supporting the president, those who agreed with or were going along with or didn't denounce or didn't disagree with some of his behavior, and how that made you feel. And so, if this person, this friend, this neighbor, this loved one, this companion who you felt like, we go back, I've known you since, and we have a relationship, and this other person, outside entity comes in and starts treating me a certain way and targeting me a certain way, how you respond, I'm going to make note of. And if you choose not to say anything by being silent, I'm going to make note of that. If you choose to empower that person, then I'm going to make note of that. And either those two options are obviously going to leave me feeling, as they say, some kind of way, aggravating the trauma, because now I feel like my ally I can't trust and is no longer my ally. They don't have my back. They aren't looking out for me, and in their own way are going along with and have endorsed and condoned the behavior coming from my attacker. Now, I'm coming at this from a mental health perspective, trying to highlight the emotional stress that people have been experiencing for years, pre, during, and post pandemic, to help explain where we all are currently and what we have not addressed. I'm boiling this down to an individual kind of relationship to make it plain, but we extrapolate this out to a larger extent. And these are the dynamics going on between one group of people and another group of people and how we're interacting with each other. This is why there's polarization, because certain groups, certain individuals are feeling attacked and targeted and maybe not feeling supported as they would like to be by other people around them that they feel like they have loved, trusted, depended upon, whatever. And so, boiling this down to you, when you look around your circle, your friends, your family, and just acknowledging the damaged relationships that you may have already been experiencing before the pandemic may have hit because of the political environment and some of the rhetoric that was taking place then. Think about how you were impacted then, on top of all the other stressors that you were dealing with, and just make a note of that trauma, of that stress 3 years pre pandemic. Then we move into March 2020. Please be mindful as you're listening to this. If this ends up causing too much stress or triggering trauma, please step away, turn it off, go listen to some happy music or look at the clouds. If you do have the space and you do feel comfortable, go back to when the pandemic hit. Oftentimes we say that the pandemic only exaggerated, amplified, exacerbated, pick your term, what was already there. So all of the stress and trauma that I was just speaking about was already there prior to the pandemic, whether we're looking at the collective stressors or the individual stressors, they were already there. Then the pandemic hits, something that most of us, I do remember hearing stories of a few people who had survived the last pandemic, but most of us had never seen anything like that. So remember the fear and the anxiety that came along with the pandemic. This episode is about acknowledging what we have not acknowledged and addressing what we have not addressed, the emotional stress of all of this. There was a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. While we have gotten to a different place, it was very real then. I'm smiling because I'm thinking about going to the grocery store and how strategic and like mission focused I would be when I would go to the store. I also remember everything was clean, like there was nothing there on the shelves. But I can remember going in with my cart, and of course stores were busy. I would put my cart at the end of the aisle, surveying wherever it was I had to go. And anybody who knows me knows I walk fast. So I'm moving through the grocery store. I come to an aisle, I put the cart at the end of the aisle. If there's a lot of people on the aisle, and especially if somebody is coughing, I inhaled, I went in, I grabbed what I needed, and I moved it back to the cart, put my stuff in, going on to the next aisle. Fear, anxiety, not knowing what the situation would be from one place to the next, hearing stories of people exposed and dying. Let's not minimize the actual death, the number of people that we lost and that died as a result of the pandemic. Do you remember all of that? I can remember the stories of the refrigerated trucks being moved to hospitals and places because there wasn't enough space for all of the bodies of those who had died. Do you remember these things? And of course, there was more death and dying in certain groups, certain marginalized groups, whether you're looking at race or economic status. A lot of people, for different reasons, lost their lives, unfortunately and unnecessarily, because of that. In addition, because of our efforts to try and control it as best as we could, we also had to isolate. So we're now separated from friends, family, and loved ones that we used to connect with. And we know that isolation and, and loneliness is bad for your health and detrimental. But these are things that happen quickly and instantaneously. All of a sudden, I can't go see my loved one who's in the assisted living facility. Remember how some of the staff had to just stay there because some of the places were having outbreaks of COVID 19. Nobody could come, nobody could go. You have partners and spouses who couldn't see each other, speaking to each other through the window with signs up. Do you remember all of these things? And that's just part of the story. Then you have a change in our living situation. So, because we have to isolate, we're all at home now. If you are actually in an abusive relationship, in a toxic relationship where now you're spending all of this time together, that is not necessarily a safe place to be and puts that individual at more risk, more trauma. Then there are those who maybe weren't dealing with that, but now we got all the family in the house together. And while we love each other, we don't like each other that much. Now I'm working at home. The kids are here. They got to do school. I've got to work, but also do school and make sure they're on task. The place is a wreck because I'm trying to create workspace where there didn't used to have to be workspace and all of these things going on. I still need to get food ready, all of this stuff. And then for those trying to navigate the telework option, there is a loss of boundaries for many where work becomes home and home becomes work. And so, what used to be I got off at this time, I clocked out and I was done. Well, now that work is at home, I'm working longer hours. I'm not taking breaks. I'm drained and I'm tapped out. And so, we've got all of that emotional stress that's going on as well. Then there are just straight up work and workplace issues. While many people did get the option to telework, a lot of people did not. And there are plenty of essential workers who were put at risk, whether you were driving a bus, whether you were in a meat factory, or whether you were medical staff or nurse in hospitals. They kept working. There was no stopping. They had to keep enduring through the period where we don't have all the masks available, where we don't have all the social distancing quite yet in order, and we're just out here. Think of the fear if you were that person, or just reminding yourself of these things that people had to deal with. If you did have the telework option, there are a number of people who were dealing with increased micromanagement. So, yes, you got the privilege and luxury of being able to work from home, but now all of a sudden, your management, your leadership is questioning what you're doing with your time. And there's more monitoring on your work as far as what you're doing. And now you have to report this, and now you have to track that where you didn't used to. But just because there's this telework option, I'm not sure I really trust you. So, yeah. And let us not forget those who just did not have any work options, who were laid off, job loss, period, point blank. And the lines. Do you remember the stories and the pictures of the lines in the unemployment office? People needing to apply for unemployment because we were shut down and their jobs were gone just like that. And so think about the emotional reaction and the trauma of losing your job, losing your income, and also for many, losing your sense of identity, because many of us define ourselves by what we do. And if we're not doing what we feel like we should, then who am I? Or if I'm not able to provide, then what am I to my family and to my loved ones? All of this emotion going on is part of the ripple effect of the pandemic. And let's not forget the social side of things. Your social life, your social network and connections, and your spiritual life, and your church and spiritual practices and relationships. How were those impacted? How were those stopped or interrupted? Unable to connect with your group of people that helped you get through some of the challenges and things that life threw at you? How did you function when you could no longer see your good friends in this social setting that you always had the opportunity to? The support network that many of us may have taken advantage of or leaned on or utilized is gone also. We've also got the financial stress, and inflation begins to go, right? Remember the gas prices. One of those times the gas prices spiked, and it was like, I'm not driving anywhere. I have to stay home because I can't afford it. We also started dealing with the supply chain issues too. So we had the delays, the long delays in some things. I can remember family member ordering furniture, and I think it took like a year to get here. It took that long for things to navigate through the supply chain. Now, these are just some of the collective stressors and trauma that we were dealing with. All of these different things happening, there is a layer and a level of grief that has to happen as well. We can't talk about the pandemic and loss of life, loss of relationships, and all these things and not recognize that that's going to cause a grieving experience, or it creates a grieving experience that needs to happen. And this is one of the areas I'm not sure we've processed. We lost a lot of lives. There were a lot of funerals, a lot of death. But how did we process that collectively? Did you really process that? I'm sure you had family and friends. Maybe you couldn't even make it to the funeral because of protocols and distancing and all of that. So, did you get a chance to really process or get the closure that maybe you typically would have? The fellowshipping and the connecting that often comes after the loss of life, where we lean in and support those loved ones. Did we get a chance to do that? Did those who experienced the loss feel the love and the support of those communities around them? Or did we just keep pressing forward? Aside from the actual grieving death and loss of life, what about those broken relationships? The broken relationships as a result of the politics of the time and everything going on. Did we process? Did we grieve the broken relationships? The jobs that were lost. If I have been doing what I've been doing for years and all of a sudden that's been taken away from me, then who am I? What am I going to do? How do I define myself? How do I consider myself contributing to society? All of these things. Of course, we're grieving a loss of money too and a loss of income, but all of these things that I just ticked off, we were essentially needing to grieve the way that we used to live. I'm not sure any of us have really processed that. We've acknowledged it here and there that, hey, that's pre-pandemic, it's pandemic times. We don't do that anymore. And remember when, but have we really just had time to just process it the way that we need to? I don't know. I can say, generally speaking, we don't really grieve. We tend not to believe in staying down and feeling bad, don't wallow in those feelings. So we don't necessarily encourage grief. And yet, grief is something that is so significant and so heavy and something that everybody is going to deal with, but we're not comfortable with difficult feelings. And so we don't really provide space for grieving in a general everyday situation. So, of course, it's no surprise that we're not giving people an opportunity to grieve all of the different layers and levels of loss associated with the pandemic. All of these different things that I've ticked off with regard to just the pandemic alone. This is also the time period where it felt like we were in the remix of the civil rights era. This also included the death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and a number of other individuals, too many individuals who lost their life due to racial factors, the Black Lives Matter protest. We also experienced a loss of leadership from the civil rights movement. And being here in the Atlanta metro area, it was felt maybe even more significantly losing C.T. Vivian, Joseph Lowry, John Lewis, all of that at the same time during the pandemic, blow after blow after blow. Later in the year, I can remember where I was when I heard that Chadwick Boseman died. And I can remember when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed as well. So there was just the sentiment in the air of, I'm done with 2020. I'm tired of it. Like 2020, can we just be done? This has been a horrible year for so many people. Trauma, drama, stress, all of that just in 2020. What did we do with it? Where did all of that stress go? How did we process it? How did you feel as I ticked off all of those different things that we experienced collectively? This doesn't take into consideration the individual stressors that you were dealing with. How did it impact your relationships? What about medical issues? Maybe there were some individual medical issues that you already had on your plate. Do you remember the stress? Looking at it from that toxic relationship example again. If I am going through all of that, how is my neighbor responding? Everything that was there pre pandemic only being exacerbated, amplified, exaggerated by the pandemic. So, verbal attacks, insensitive rhetoric, it was already there. We put the pandemic over it and it becomes bigger, badder, stronger. If I'm on the receiving end of that and I'm looking for help, how is my neighbor responding? Are they being silent? Are they afraid to speak up? Are they empowering the individual who is doing the attacking? This is what it looks like at an individual level for those being targeted, those who are observing. This is why there are such extreme feelings and reactions. Because if I'm being targeted and I don't feel safe and I'm looking to you for help, support, some kind of a lifeline and I'm not seeing it, it creates even more trauma by your inaction or deliberate action to empower that person. I feel betrayed. I really didn't know you. I thought you were somebody that you're not. And it causes even more heartache, hurt, and trauma for the people on the receiving end of those attacks. This is why you don't talk to that person who supports the president. This is why we have those spaces where we just step light and we talk about sunshine and flowers and we don't get into the politics because we know if we go there, it's going to open up some really difficult feelings. So, my challenge and question to you is consider how you responded to the stress and the trauma then. I kept asking you, do you remember? Think about, recall, try not to get you stuck in a bad place, but to address and acknowledge what has not been acknowledged. We have been experiencing collective trauma and chronic stress for at least 4 years since the pandemic, not to mention 3 years prior under the president. How did you experience it then? What did you feel in your body when I described and revisited some of those different scenarios? Where did all of that stress go? What did you do with it then? How did you handle it? Did you handle it? Did you stuff it in that back closet and try to ignore it and hope it goes away? Well, let me tell you, ignoring the stuff does not make it go away. That closet just gets full. It gets packed with more and more stuff that we're not trying to deal with until eventually it starts bubbling and coming out. And then when we turn the corner from 2020 into 2021, we hit January 6th. And then the trauma that was experienced by observing the attack on the Capitol and the insurrection. That is a traumatic experience for many people and it brings up a lot of feelings. How do we deal with it? Not acknowledging the trauma from during the pandemic. Then we stack on trauma from the insurrection. And then as we transition back to normal, how do we do that? We transition back to work, school, social, and church related activities. What was that transition like? Was there a transition? Were you thrust back into situations, routines, expectations? Were you expected to be doing the same that you did before? Were you expected to be doing more? Did you have an opportunity to have input on how that transition will work? Was it even a transition? All of these things are intertwined. Whether we're looking at the political aspect of it, the pandemic aspect of it, because of the timeline, it's all interwoven and intertwined, which is also why having the president return to office triggers a trauma response in so many people because it feels like all of that trauma that we experience, whether it was directly about the political stuff or just the pandemic, we associate it with the president. Not saying it's right or wrong or anything like that, just showing that all of this stuff is interwoven. And we have not taken the time to really process it, really discuss it, and really deal with the implications and the ramifications of the pandemic and the political stress that we've been experiencing, which brings me back to the current situation and your current situation. What are you feeling now? Like we know the polarization that's going on at a larger level, but how are you responding in the present moment when it comes to the president returning to office? Are you finding that some of the past areas of trauma are being reopened or resurfacing? This is about me trying to help you become aware that what you might be experiencing now is just old stuff. Opening up some wounds that weren't given enough attention at the time that they deserved. Not to say that what you're feeling is not warranted, whether it's fear, anxiety about how we move forward, like all of that, I get that. But at the same time, we may also be opening up some old wounds that we never really addressed or dealt with. How did you deal with all of that trauma from the past? Where did it go in your body? What pains, aches, and situations do you have going on in your body that might be related to that past trauma? How is it impacting you today? Did you process it? What are you doing with it? Do you have a plan? And bringing it back to that last scenario of how does it play in a toxic relationship? If you know that a relationship is unhealthy, it's toxic, that you are being manipulated, gaslighted. When you get to that place where you know that you need to separate from it and you find the strength and the capability to move on so you can heal. How do you heal when you're going to re-engage in that same relationship with the full understanding that there has been no effort on the other side to be better, do better? If you have not processed or acknowledged or addressed some of the trauma from the past several years, pre pandemic, during the pandemic, and post pandemic, as you look ahead and anticipate what's to come, knowing that your bandwidth is likely already full, you can bet that you are going to be in for it as we head into a situation that guarantees more trauma headed our way. So you've got to be proactive. Sometimes I'm not trying to harp on core work, but you got to be proactive about this thing because it's coming. This is not going to be an easy time. So you've got to be intentional about getting ahead of certain stressors, getting ahead of certain situations so that you can be halfway sane to deal with life. And to that end, going back to the idea of trauma, how do you know if you are experiencing a trauma response? We hear post traumatic stress and things like that. Let me just say trauma can show up in a lot of different ways. Common things are those intrusive thoughts. If you find yourself a little anxious, fearful, hyper vigilant, completely normal. But then there's also just general stress responses that we can experience, like stomach problems, difficulty sleeping, irritability, moodiness. The list is really extensive, and I encourage you to do some of your own research and be proactive about checking how you're doing and how you're responding. Go to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administrative website, SAMHSA.gov, and get some information about trauma and educate yourself about what it looks like and how it might show up, because trauma is equal opportunity for everybody. It does not matter who you are. You can experience it directly, you can also experience it vicariously. So, watching, observing other people experience trauma or a traumatic event can also create trauma for you. So, keep that in mind. But be aware of how you are experiencing and addressing your emotional stress, past, present, and potentially future. Ways to go about taking care of yourself. First and foremost is to give yourself permission to be human and extend yourself some compassion and grace. This is the part where you can say, you know what, I'm still impacted by the pandemic. That thing still affects me. I'm still mourning the loss of XYZ. I'm still trying to get over how we no longer do blah, blah, blah. You need to give yourself permission to grieve, deal with the loss, whatever level of grief it is, whether it's from an actual loss of life or loss of the way that you used to do, fill in the blank. Give yourself permission and hold that space for you to do that. Allow yourself time to process it, time to process, yes, the grief, but also any other difficult feelings from the past trauma, present trauma, and what may be ahead. Try to share your story. And with that, that's not necessarily getting on blast and sharing everything that you dealt with, but maybe just writing in a journal, talking to your friends and family, using your support system to talk it out. So if you have that thought that I really shouldn't talk about it, I should just keep it to myself, I'm going to invite you to please consider reconsidering and give yourself room to talk about it and just share with friends, family, write in a journal, do an audio journal, whatever may work for you to get it out. Don't forget your faith. Utilize your faith system, your spiritual practices to help you navigate the grief and the other difficult feelings that may surface as a result of your trying to process and heal from the trauma. Of course, I'm not going to tell you not to get moving. Get moving. This is psycho or fitness. So, yes, move when you can. Now, be gentle and be mindful of what your body feels and what it may need at a particular point in time. But stress, creates anxiety and energy in the body. So moving might help you process some of that extra energy. You can also consider, as I mentioned on some of my other podcast episodes, meditating for mindfulness to help you become aware of your thoughts, how they're running through your mind, and learning how to manage them in such a way so that your thoughts aren't running away with you. You know you better than anybody else. And you know if you need to unpack some things. You know if you got a lot that you really need to address that you have not addressed. If that's the case, then get professional help. You're the one carrying around all the stress. You're the one dealing with it in ways that nobody else knows, not just your mind and your heart, but it's also impacting your body. So, why not take advantage of the resources that are available to support you through that process? I know sometimes it may feel like I can't open that up. If I open that up, I may not be able to close it up, or I'm afraid I can't manage it. Yes, you can with professional help. Seek professional help so you have someone to walk with you through all of that maybe you've been putting off and trying to ignore. It's not going to go away. It's going to come back in a different way, probably bigger and better. So access the support that you need. Lastly, don't forget to take care of your basics. These are things that are generally within your control, and that is making healthy eating choices. It's going to help you feel better. It's going to help you function better physically and mentally. Get enough sleep. You can also participate in my 14-day sleep challenge. Trauma is a stress response, spiking energy, spiking anxiety. And so, if we get enough sleep, it will help bring down our baseline anxiety level. So, those are just some tips to help you with processing and addressing some of the emotional stress that you may have experienced as a result of the pandemic and the political environments over the past, what are we now, 7, 8 years? So that's my challenge to you. Deal with it, address it, get help if you need to. I want to thank you for listening to this. This is a heavy subject. It's not easy to deal with this, and this is why we often avoid it. But I want to give you kudos because if you did listen to this, and if you are noodling around with some of these questions and challenges that I gave you, then that already suggests that you're doing a little bit of self care and attending to your own emotional needs. That's good work, and I encourage you to continue doing so. I look forward to seeing you next time. And again, thank you so much for your support and for joining me during this episode. Take care. I'll see you next time.